There are few authors throughout history that once I read the first book from them, I was completely in love with them. Well, guess what? Terry Pratchett is another author in that list that I have absolutely fallen in love with from the get-go, from the first book. I read The Color of Magic. Currently, this week, I will start reading the books related to death, right? Second book and so on and so forth. So I can read all the books where death shows up, and I can actually review this great character that I have heard hyped up a lot in a lot of media. So let's talk about why I love Terry Pratchett. And I want you to tell me down in the comments below if you do love him as well. The first great reason that why I love him is how a lot of fantasy authors at the time, back in the day, when they were writing fantasy, they shied away from the weird, the strange parts of the fantasy genre. This was because the fantasy did not used to be as much of a powerhouse back in the day, so you didn't want to be classified as fantasy. Even though you wrote fantasy, you still didn't want to get classified as fantasy. There were literary snobs who had way more power back then. The market was not as friendly to fantasy in general. It sold way less. And a lot of fantasy authors opted to just essentially say, I don't write fantasy, much like Terry Goodkind. But Terry Pratchett was the opposite of Terry Goodkind. Terry. And essentially, he was a complete fantasy author. He went complete bonkers. I mean, the concepts within, just in The Color of Magic, in the Discworld, is absolutely insane. There is narrativium. If you imagine it, or if people believe it, it is there. And narrativium is such an absurdist concept, it is insane, because it means the universe they live in, whatever mythological stuff that the people come up with to justify or to explain the world, it essentially, the world becomes that. That is the fact of the world. That is the reality of the world, right? And it is so interesting and so unique. You can summon a dragon with your imagination. It's so brilliant. And it is so fantasy. There is just so much absurdism and there's so much fantasy just brimming within the first book, The Color of Magic. It is absolutely insane, okay? And so a lot of authors don't do that. Number two, if you read modern fantasy authors don't really do this as well. Honestly, they don't do it. And I don't know why. It might be because of, Game of Thrones. A lot of people have explanations, but oftentimes nowadays the trend is minimalist fantasy. I don't like minimalist fantasy, number one. I prefer full-on fantasy. Number three, I prefer Terry Pratchett fantasy. I like the fantasy to be giga fantasy, okay? I want absurdist nonsense, and I really love that absurdist nonsense from Terry Pratchett. It's just, I'm a huge fan. Another thing that Terry Pratchett happens to do very well is that the journey within his story happened to revolve around the characters. And there is a journey, it's going to be around the character. There's an argument, it's going to be around the character. Everything is to affect the character, to motivate the character, to attack the weaknesses of the character. You can see this with Rincewind. He runs away from everything, but the journey that he goes on, The Color of Magic, to the edge of the world, happens to really force him to confront things that he is not comfortable with. This is very simple, but it looks very simple. A lot of authors, if not most authors, fail to do this consistently over and over and over. They have stories that are obsessed with how awesome their magic system is, or how awesome their premise is, or how awesome their world building is, forgetting that stories ought to explore humanity. They ought to attack the characters within those stories and to inspire them and to teach them and to get them to, to go on journeys where they have character arcs. This is very crucial. A lot of authors fail to do this. Terry Pratchett successfully does this, and he repeatedly successfully does this even with supporting cast. In other words, the supporting cast are oftentimes better than the protagonists of a lot of authors out there. Another thing that is easily loved about Terry Pratchett and is loved universally is actually the prose of his stories, how funny they are, how beautiful the images that he puts in your head are, and also how essentially there's a lot of wit And I love that it's a lot of fun. It's fun. If you're reading a book, you're supposed to have fun. And if you're reading Terry Pratchett, you're gonna have fun. So I'm really, really glad that there's so many books within the Discworld that I can essentially dive into. And this week, the next week, it's gonna be fun because I'll essentially be reading 4 of these books. They are not huge totems. Yes, I hope that you enjoyed this. Tell me what are the things that you love or hate about Terry Pratchett. Again, it's really okay to disagree on things. You can hate him as much as I love him. So there you go. I hope that you enjoyed this. Have a nice day. Bye.